It started like any other evening in the quiet neighborhood Dorothy Harris had called home for decades. At 68 years old, Dorothy was known for her warm smile and her habit of taking long evening walks to clear her mind. That night, the streetlights flickered softly, casting long shadows across the pavement as she strolled down the familiar block. But something was different. A sense of unease hung in the air. Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. What happened next would change her life forever. From the corner of her eye, she saw the flashing lights of a patrol car pulling up alongside her. She paused, unsure of what to expect. The officer who stepped out was one she recognized by name, Officer Jacob Blake. He had a reputation in the community, and not a good one. Stories circulated about his intimidating tactics and abuse of authority, but no one ever dared to challenge him. Dorothy felt her stomach twist as Blake approached, his smirk sending a chill down her spine. "Ma'am, we've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, his tone oozing with condescension. Dorothy frowned, confused. "Suspicious activity? Officer, I'm just taking my usual walk. I live right down the street." But Blake didn't seem interested in her explanation. Instead, his demeanor shifted, becoming more aggressive. Before she could fully grasp what was happening, Blake grabbed her arm, his grip uncomfortably tight. Dorothy tried to protest, but her voice trembled, fear choking her words. "This is for your own good," Blake said coldly. In the next horrifying moments, Dorothy found herself tied to a street lamp with duct tape, her cries for help ignored. Blake stood a few feet away, watching with an air of satisfaction, as though her humiliation was some kind of twisted joke. Passers-by avoided getting involved, their eyes averted. Only one man, a homeless individual who often stayed in the area, tried to intervene, shouting at Blake to let her go. His bravery earned him a stern warning and a threat, sending him retreating into the shadows. Dorothy's world spun as the humiliation and helplessness consumed her. When Blake finally drove off, leaving her taped and abandoned under the cold glow of the street lamp, she felt broken, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Eventually, a kind stranger found her and called for help, freeing her from the makeshift prison Blake had left her in. Hours later, Dorothy's son, Jonathan Harris, burst through the door of her modest home. A decorated military officer known for his unwavering sense of justice, Jonathan had always been his mother's protector. Seeing her frail frame trembling in a chair, her wrists red and raw from the tape, sent a wave of fury through him unlike anything he'd ever felt before. "Mom, who did this to you?" Jonathan asked, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and concern. Dorothy hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. She didn't want to burden her son, but the weight of the experience was too heavy to bear alone. In a soft, broken voice, she recounted the night's events, each word cutting Jonathan like a knife. Jonathan's jaw tightened as he listened, his fists clenching at his sides. This wasn't just about his mother. It was about abuse of power, about a man who had no right to wear a badge acting like he was above the law. Jonathan knew he couldn't let this go. He couldn't stand by while someone like Blake continued to hurt others. But Jonathan also knew this fight wouldn't be easy. Blake wasn't just a road cop. He was part of a system that protected its own. Jonathan would need more than anger to bring him down. He'd need evidence, allies, and an unshakable resolve. The next morning, Jonathan got to work. Using his military credentials, he accessed hours of surveillance footage from the area where his mother had been attacked. His heart pounded as he scoured the tapes, and after an exhaustive search, he found what he was looking for: Blake's patrol car on camera, the damning evidence he needed to start building his case. But as Jonathan dug deeper, he realized this wasn't just about Blake. Complaints against the officer stretched back years, and reports of misconduct had been mysteriously buried or dismissed. This was bigger than he had imagined, a system rotten to its core. Jonathan's mission was clear. He wasn't just going to get justice for his mother. He was going to expose the corruption and hold everyone involved accountable. But would he succeed against a machine designed to silence people like him? As Jonathan pieced together his plan, he reached out to a former military comrade for help. "Mike, I need you to dig into an officer named Jacob Blake. Find everything you can," he said, his voice steady but charged with urgency. Mike's response was immediate. "I'll help, but you're walking into dangerous territory. If Blake's been protected all this time, it's because powerful people are backing him." Jonathan's resolve only hardened. "Then we'll take them down too." The battle was just beginning, and Jonathan knew the road ahead would be treacherous. But he wasn't fighting alone. Armed with his mother's courage, the support of his family, and an unyielding determination, Jonathan was ready to face whatever came next. What he didn't know was that this fight would uncover secrets far darker than he could have imagined, and that Blake wasn't planning to go down without a fight. Stay tuned for the rest of this incredible story. Jonathan Harris sat in his mother's small kitchen, the ticking clock on the wall marking every passing second as if it were urging him to act faster. Dorothy sat across from him, her trembling hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Her eyes avoided his, as though speaking about what happened would only make it more real. Jonathan could see the pain etched into every line of her face, and it fueled the fire burning in his chest. "Mom, this isn't just about what he did to you," Jonathan said, his voice low and steady. "How many others do you think he's hurt? People who didn't have anyone to fight for them." Dorothy shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just want to forget it, Jonathan. I don't want any trouble." But trouble was already here, Jonathan thought. Forgetting wasn't an option when the person sworn to protect the community had turned his badge into a weapon of fear. Jonathan knew his mother wasn't the first victim, and unless someone stopped him, she wouldn't be the last. Determined to learn more about Officer Jacob Blake, Jonathan spent the next few days making quiet inquiries. He spoke with neighbors, local business owners, and even some community leaders. The stories he heard painted a chilling picture. Blake had a long history of using his authority to intimidate, humiliate, and harm. Some victims had tried to report him, but their complaints seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving them with no justice and a deep distrust of the system. One shop owner, an older man named Mr. Patel, reluctantly shared his own encounter. "He came in here a few months ago," Mr. Patel said, glancing nervously at the door. "Accused me of selling expired goods. I showed him my inventory records, but he wasn't interested. He threatened to shut me down unless I cooperated. I had no choice but to pay him off." Jonathan clenched his jaw, his anger simmering just below the surface. Blake wasn't just abusive, he was corrupt. As Jonathan pieced together more stories, he noticed a pattern. Blake's victims were often vulnerable: elderly residents, small business owners, and people without the resources to fight back. It was as if Blake had carefully chosen his targets, ensuring they wouldn't pose a threat to his position. But Jonathan wasn't going to let that stop him. Armed with a growing list of testimonies, he contacted an old friend from his military days, Mike Davis, who now worked as a private investigator. Mike's expertise in uncovering hidden truths would be invaluable in this fight. "Blake's been operating like this for years," Jonathan explained during a late-night phone call. "I need you to help me connect the dots, find out who's been covering for him and why." Mike agreed without hesitation. "If this guy's as bad as you say, it's not just about him anymore. There's a whole network enabling him, and it's time to shine a light on it." While Mike began digging into Blake's professional record, Jonathan focused on gaining the trust of the community. He organized a small meeting at the local church, inviting those who had stories to share. At first, only a handful of people showed up, their faces a mix of fear and skepticism. "I know it's hard to speak out," Jonathan began, his voice filled with quiet conviction, "but if we stay silent, we're letting him win. My mother wasn't his first victim, and I'm sure she won't be the last. We have to stand together." One by one, the attendees began to open up, their voices hesitant but resolute. A single mother recounted how Blake had searched her car without cause, humiliating her in front of her children. A young man described being stopped and frisked multiple times while simply walking to work. The stories poured out, each one adding weight to the growing case against Blake. But Jonathan knew stories alone wouldn't be enough. He needed hard evidence, proof that couldn't be ignored or buried. That's where Mike came in. A few days later, Mike called with an update. "You're not going to believe this," he said. Blake's been flagged in multiple internal reports for misconduct, but every time, someone higher up has stepped in to make the complaints disappear. Jonathan's heart sank. How high does this go? It's hard to say, Mike replied, but it's clear he's got powerful allies. This isn't just about a bad cop, it's about a system that's protecting him. The revelation only strengthened Jonathan's resolve. He began documenting everything, every story, every piece of evidence, every connection. He knew he was walking a dangerous line. Going up against someone like Blake, with the backing of a corrupt system, wasn't just risky, it was life-threatening. And Blake wasn't oblivious to Jonathan's efforts. Word had gotten back to him about the meeting at the church and the questions being asked around town. One evening, as Jonathan walked to his car, he noticed a patrol vehicle idling a few houses down. The figure inside was unmistakable. Blake's piercing gaze met Jonathan's, a silent warning that sent a chill down his spine. Jonathan refused to be intimidated. He locked eyes with Blake, his expression unwavering. If Blake thought fear would stop him, he was wrong. But the encounter was a stark reminder of the stakes. This wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a fight for safety, for dignity, for the soul of the community. And as Jonathan dug deeper, he realized the cost of failure would be far greater than he'd imagined. One night, while reviewing his notes, Jonathan's phone buzzed with a text from Mike. It was a single line, but it carried the weight of 1,000 words. Found something big. We need to meet. Jonathan's pulse quickened as he read the message. Whatever Mike had uncovered, it was significant. But he also knew that the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous this mission would become. As he prepared to meet Mike, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Blake wasn't going to sit idly by while they unraveled his web of lies. The walls were closing in, and the next move could make or break everything. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they formed was darker than Jonathan had ever anticipated. What he didn't know was that the real fight was just beginning, and the cost of justice might be more than he was prepared to pay. Jonathan parked his car a few blocks away from Mike's office, choosing to walk the rest of the way. The quiet hum of the streetlights and the distant sound of cars passing by felt almost too peaceful, as though the world itself was unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. His mind raced with possibilities. Whatever Mike had found, it was big enough to warrant urgency, and Jonathan knew this meeting could change everything. When he entered the small, dimly lit office, Mike was already waiting, his face tense. A thick manila folder sat on the desk between them. Jonathan sat down, his eyes fixed on Mike. "You weren't kidding," Mike said, sliding the folder toward Jonathan. "This goes deeper than I thought." Jonathan opened the folder and began sifting through the documents. There were bank statements, emails, and internal memos from the police department, all pointing to a tangled web of corruption. Blake wasn't just acting alone. He was part of a broader scheme involving several officers and even a few local officials. They were using their positions to exploit the community, funneling money through fake fines, seized property, and other illicit means. "They've been protecting him because he's their enforcer," Mike explained. "He intimidates anyone who gets too close to the truth, and anyone who refuses to play along. Well, let's just say their careers don't last long." Jonathan felt a mix of anger and determination. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. The entire community was being held hostage by a system designed to prey on the weak. "We can't let this continue," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "But how do we bring this to light without putting a target on everyone's back?" Mike leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "We need to be smart about this. If we go public too soon, they'll bury us, and the evidence, before anyone can act. We need to build an airtight case, something so undeniable that even their allies can't protect them." In the following days, Jonathan and Mike worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle. They tracked financial records, gathered witness statements, and connected the dots between the players involved. It was a painstaking process, but every new discovery brought them closer to the truth. Meanwhile, tensions in the community were reaching a boiling point. Word of Blake's actions and the growing investigation began to spread, sparking quiet murmurs of resistance. People who had once been too afraid to speak out were finding strength in their shared experiences, but with that courage came increased scrutiny. One afternoon, as Jonathan visited a local diner to meet with another potential witness, he noticed two uniformed officers sitting at a corner booth. Their eyes followed him as he walked in, their presence a not-so-subtle reminder that Blake and his allies were watching. The witness, a middle-aged woman named Carla, was hesitant at first. She glanced nervously at the officers before leaning in to whisper. "He came to my house last year," she began, "said there were complaints about noise, but we both knew that wasn't true. He threatened to take my son away if I didn't hand over cash." Jonathan's stomach turned as he listened. Carla's story was heartbreakingly familiar, yet it only strengthened his resolve. Before leaving, he assured her that she wasn't alone and that their voices would make a difference. As the investigation deepened, Jonathan began to see cracks forming in Blake's armor. The officer's usual air of invincibility was giving way to paranoia. He started showing up unannounced at community events, his presence a clear attempt to intimidate anyone who might speak out. But instead of silencing them, his actions only fueled their anger. One evening, Jonathan received an anonymous tip about a warehouse on the outskirts of town. The caller claimed it was being used to store evidence of the group's illegal activities. Though it sounded risky, Jonathan knew he couldn't ignore the lead. Mike agreed to go with him, and under the cover of darkness, they approached the warehouse. The building was nondescript, its windows covered with grime and its doors secured with heavy locks. Mike picked the lock with practiced ease, and the two men slipped inside. What they found was both shocking and damning. Boxes filled with confiscated goods, falsified documents, and even surveillance equipment lined the walls. It was clear that this was more than just a storage facility, it was a hub for their operations. As they documented everything, the sound of approaching footsteps made their blood run cold. Jonathan and Mike barely had time to hide before the door creaked open, and a flashlight beam swept across the room. Two figures entered, their voices low but tense. "They're getting too close," one of them said. "If we don't shut this down now, it's over for all of us." Jonathan held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The tension was unbearable, but he knew they couldn't afford to be discovered. As the men left, Jonathan and Mike waited until the coast was clear before slipping out of the warehouse. The evidence they had gathered was invaluable, but it also came with a stark realization. Their enemies were becoming desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. In the days that followed, Jonathan worked to secure the evidence, storing copies in multiple locations and sharing key findings with trusted allies. But the closer they got to exposing the truth, the more the pressure mounted. Blake's intimidation tactics escalated, and the line between justice and personal safety grew increasingly blurred. Jonathan knew they were walking a razor's edge, and one wrong move could bring everything crashing down. Yet, even as the odds stacked against them, the community's resolve only grew stronger. The people who had once lived in fear were now standing together, their voices rising in defiance of the corruption that had held them captive for so long. But the fight was far from over, and Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest battles were yet to come. The truth was within reach, but so were the forces determined to keep it buried. And as the tension reached a fever pitch, one question loomed over everything. How far would they go to silence him? Jonathan could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him as he sat in his dimly lit apartment, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound cutting through the silence. The evidence was damning, but exposing it felt like standing on a cliff edge during a storm. Every step forward was met with resistance, and every moment of progress brought more danger. The thought of what could happen to his mother, to himself, to anyone who had come forward, kept him awake at night. Still, he knew they were too deep into this now to turn back. That night, a text message lit up Jonathan's phone. It was from Mike. "Meet me at the diner. Urgent." Jonathan's chest tightened as he read the message. Mike wasn't one for dramatics, but his words carried a sense of urgency that couldn't be ignored. Jonathan grabbed his coat and headed out, his mind racing with possibilities. The diner was almost empty when Jonathan arrived, its neon sign flickering against the night sky. Inside, Mike was sitting in a booth near the back, his expression grim. On the table in front of him was a small USB drive. "This," Mike said quietly as Jonathan slid into the seat across from him, "is the final piece." Jonathan picked up the drive, turning it over in his fingers. "What's on it?" "Video footage," Mike replied, "from inside the warehouse. It's everything we've been looking for, proof of their operations, their meetings, even their faces." Jonathan's heart raced as he realized the magnitude of what they were holding. This was it, the evidence they needed to blow the whole thing wide open. But before he could respond, Mike leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "They know we're close," he said. "I've been followed the last 2 days. They're not just watching anymore, they're hunting." The air felt heavy with the weight of his words. Jonathan nodded, his mind already working through their next steps. They couldn't wait any longer. The footage had to be made public before it was too late. But the plan wasn't as simple as hitting upload. They needed a secure platform, one that couldn't be taken down or traced back to them too quickly. And they needed to prepare for the fallout, because there would be fallout. As they left the diner, Jonathan noticed a black SUV parked across the street. Its tinted windows and idle engine sent a chill down his spine. He didn't need to see the driver to know they were being watched. The drive back to his apartment was tense. Every car that passed felt like a potential threat, every shadow a possible ambush. Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, but he didn't dare take a direct route home. When he finally reached his apartment, he double-checked the locks and pulled the blinds shut. He and Mike spent the next few hours uploading the footage to multiple encrypted servers, ensuring it couldn't be easily erased. They also prepared an anonymous tip to send to a trusted journalist, someone who had a reputation for exposing corruption. But as they worked, a loud knock echoed through the apartment. Jonathan froze, his pulse quickening. Mike gestured for him to stay quiet as they both listened. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Jonathan crept to the peephole, his breath catching as he saw 2 men in plain clothes standing in the hallway. "Jonathan Carter," one of them called out, his voice cold and authoritative. "We need to speak with you." Jonathan backed away from the door, motioning for Mike to gather the evidence. He didn't know if the men outside were with the police or part of Blake's network, but either way, opening the door wasn't an option. The knocking turned to pounding, and Jonathan knew they didn't have much time. Mike quickly stuffed the USB drive and other documents into a backpack, nodding toward the fire escape. As they slipped out the window, Jonathan felt his adrenaline spike. The cool night air hit his face as they climbed down, their footsteps echoing faintly against the metal. They had to move quickly and stay out of sight. Once they reached the ground, they ducked into a nearby alley, their breaths visible in the chilly air. Jonathan's mind raced as he tried to figure out their next move. The journalist was their best bet, but getting to them without being intercepted would be a challenge. The sound of footsteps behind them made Jonathan's stomach drop. He glanced back, his heart pounding as he saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was one of the men from the hallway. "Stop," the man shouted, his hand moving toward his waistband. Jonathan and Mike took off, weaving through the alleyways and side streets. The city seemed both vast and claustrophobic as they ran, every corner potentially hiding another pursuer. They eventually found refuge in an abandoned building, its crumbling walls offering a brief moment of safety. As they caught their breath, Mike pulled out the backpack and checked its contents. The evidence was still intact, but their situation was becoming increasingly dire. "We can't keep running," Jonathan said, his voice laced with frustration. "We need to get this out now." Mike nodded, his expression resolute. "Then we go to the journalists tonight." The decision was made. Despite the risks, they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The truth had to come out, and they were willing to risk everything to make it happen. But as they prepared to leave, a faint noise outside made them pause. The sound of tires crunching on gravel sent a jolt of fear through them. Someone was close, too close. Jonathan peeked out a crack in the boarded-up window, his stomach sinking as he saw the black SUV idling nearby. This wasn't just a chase anymore. It was a game of survival, and the stakes had never been higher. They exchanged a look, unspoken determination passing between them. They were cornered, but they weren't giving up. "Not now," not when the truth was so close to being revealed. With the SUV's headlights cutting through the darkness, Jonathan and Mike knew the next few hours would be critical. Every decision, every move, could mean the difference between justice and silence. And as the tension reached a breaking point, they braced themselves for what lay ahead, knowing that the battle was far from over. Jonathan's pulse was a deafening drum in his ears as the SUV's headlights swept across the street, illuminating the crumbling edges of their hiding spot. He and Mike crouched lower, their breaths shallow as the vehicle idled just yards away. The tension was suffocating. Jonathan's mind raced, trying to predict their next move. Were they being hunted, or was this just another tactic to unnerve them? Either way, time was slipping through their fingers like sand, and every second spent hiding felt like a step closer to disaster. Mike tapped Jonathan's shoulder and motioned toward the rear exit of the building. Jonathan nodded, his muscles coiled like springs, ready to bolt. They crept silently through the shadows, their movements deliberate and cautious. Just as they reached the door, a faint beep echoed from Jonathan's pocket. His phone. The sound wasn't loud, but in the stillness, it was deafening. Jonathan's stomach twisted as he fumbled to silence it, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. The message was from an unknown number. Don't trust him. Jonathan's blood ran cold. He showed the message to Mike, whose face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Was this a warning, a diversion, or something else entirely? Before they could dwell on it, the sound of a car door slamming outside jolted them back to the moment. Jonathan peered through a crack in the boards, his heart sinking as he saw two figures stepping out of the SUV. They were armed, their movements calculated and deliberate. This wasn't a random search. They knew exactly where to look. Jonathan and Mike slipped through the back door, the night swallowing them as they fled into the maze of alleyways. The air was bitterly cold, but adrenaline burned through Jonathan's veins, keeping him moving. They needed to reach the journalist, but the message lingered in his mind like a shadow. As they rounded a corner, Mike suddenly stopped, pulling Jonathan into the recess of a doorway. "We need to talk," Mike whispered, his voice low but firm. Jonathan glanced around nervously, his instincts screaming to keep moving. "Now, they're right behind us." Mike's expression hardened. "Exactly. And if we don't figure out who sent that message, we could be running straight into a trap." Jonathan hesitated. The logic was sound, but the urgency of their situation left little room for deliberation. "Fine," he relented, his voice tense, "but make it quick." Mike leaned in, his voice barely audible. "That journalist you're so keen to meet, how well do you know them?" Jonathan blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I don't," he admitted. "But they've exposed people like Blake before. They're legit." Mike's jaw tightened. "Or they're just good at pretending to be. Think about it. How did they get their hands on Blake's secrets? And why haven't they been silenced like everyone else who's tried?" The doubt planted itself in Jonathan's mind, growing with every passing second. He wanted to dismiss Mike's concerns, but the message on his phone refused to be ignored. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps shattered their conversation. They had to move. Jonathan pushed the thoughts aside and focused on escaping, but a seed of mistrust had been sown. They zigzagged through the city, weaving through crowds and slipping into shadows whenever they could. By the time they reached the meeting point, Jonathan's legs felt like lead, and his lungs burned with every breath. The journalist was waiting in a dimly lit coffee shop, their face partially obscured by a scarf and hat. Jonathan hesitated before stepping inside, his hand brushing against the USB drive in his pocket. This was it, the moment they'd been working toward. But as he approached the table, he couldn't shake the lingering doubt. The journalist greeted them with a nod, their eyes sharp and probing. "You got something for me?" they asked, their voice low and steady. Jonathan glanced at Mike, who gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. The unspoken message was clear: "Be careful." "I need to know we're safe first," Jonathan said, his tone cautious. "How do I know you're not working with them?" The journalist's expression didn't falter, but there was a pause, a split-second hesitation that didn't go unnoticed. "If I were working with them, you wouldn't have made it this far," they replied evenly. It was a fair point, But it didn't quell the unease gnawing at Jonathan's gut. He handed over a copy of the footage, keeping the original drive securely in his pocket. "That's all you get for now," he said. "Until I know I can trust you." The journalist nodded, seemingly unfazed by the precaution. "Fair enough. I'll review this and be in touch." As they left the coffee shop, Jonathan's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. They'd taken a step forward, but the journey was far from over. The message on his phone, the journalist's hesitation, Mike's suspicions, it all pointed to something bigger, something they hadn't yet uncovered. And then, as they turned a corner, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. It was one of Blake's men, his face twisted into a cold, calculating smile. "Going somewhere?" he drawled, blocking their path. Jonathan's heart stopped. Behind him, footsteps echoed, more men closing in. They were surrounded, their escape routes cut off. The air crackled with tension as the man stepped closer, his eyes glinting with malicious intent. Jonathan clenched his fists, his mind racing for a way out. But before he could act, the man pulled out his phone and held it up, revealing a live feed. It was the footage they'd just handed to the journalist. "Looks like you've been sharing secrets," the man said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Too bad you chose the wrong person to trust." Jonathan's stomach dropped as the realization hit him like a freight train. The journalist wasn't an ally, they were a plant. And now, everything they'd worked for was in jeopardy. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as the man loomed closer, the phone screen taunting him with the betrayal he hadn't seen coming. The betrayal that could cost him everything. Mike's sharp intake of breath beside him mirrored his own shock. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped, the gravity of their situation pulling them into a suffocating silence. But then, something shifted. Jonathan's mind clicked into gear, and he remembered the USB drive still in his pocket, the original footage, untainted and secure. If there was one thing Blake and his men didn't know, it was that Jonathan always had a backup plan. Jonathan took a slow step back, his hands raised as if in surrender. "You think you've won," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside him. "But you don't even know what you're holding." The man's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty passing through his eyes. Jonathan seized on it, taking another step back to create distance. Behind him, Mike's stance shifted subtly, ready for whatever came next. "You got the footage, sure," Jonathan continued, his voice growing stronger. "But the real evidence? The kind that will bring Blake's entire operation down. That's still out there, and you'll never find it." The man's expression darkened, his confidence wavering. He barked an order into his earpiece, signaling his men to close in, but Jonathan had already made his move. With a sudden burst of speed, he grabbed a nearby trash can lid and hurled it toward the man, the clattering noise creating just enough of a distraction for him and Mike to dart into the alley. The chase was immediate and relentless, the sound of pounding footsteps echoing off the walls. Jonathan's lungs burned as he ran, his mind racing for a plan. They couldn't outrun them forever, and they couldn't afford to be caught. "Split up," Mike shouted, veering off down a side alley. Jonathan hesitated for a split second, the idea of separating filling him with dread. But Mike was right. It was their best chance. He turned down another alley, weaving through the labyrinthine streets with desperation fueling his every step. Eventually, he found himself in an abandoned warehouse, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of rusted metal. He pressed himself against a wall, trying to calm his ragged breathing. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the entrance. Jonathan's grip tightened around the USB drive in his pocket. He knew he couldn't outrun this forever, but then he noticed something, an old, half-broken ladder leading up to a series of beams near the ceiling. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. He climbed quickly and quietly, positioning himself out of sight just as the men entered the warehouse. They fanned out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched. Jonathan held his breath, every muscle in his body tense. One of the men passed directly beneath him, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Jonathan watched, his mind racing. If he could just get out of here and get the footage to the right hands, this nightmare could finally end. But then, His phone buzzed. The sound was faint, but it was enough. The man below him froze, his flashlight sweeping upward. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything stood still. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He dropped from the beam, landing hard on the man and knocking him out cold. The others shouted in alarm, their lights converging on his location. Jonathan bolted for the nearest exit, his heart pounding like a drum. As he burst out into the open air, a car screeched to a halt in front of him. For a split second, he thought it was Blake's men, but then the door swung open, and Mike leaned out. "Get in." Jonathan didn't need to be told twice. He dove into the passenger seat, slamming the door as Mike floored the gas. The car sped off, the sound of gunfire ringing out behind them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of what just happened settling over them like a heavy blanket. "You okay?" Mike finally asked, glancing over at Jonathan. Jonathan nodded, clutching the USB drive tightly. "We've got to get this to someone we can trust," he said, his voice firm. "Someone who can actually do something about Blake." Mike didn't respond right away, his expression unreadable. "I know someone," he said finally, "but we'll have to move fast. If they know you've still got the evidence, they'll be coming for us." As they drove into the night, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. They'd escaped for now, but Blake's reach was long, and his power was vast. But then, just as they were about to cross the state line, Jonathan's phone buzzed again. This time, the message was from an entirely new number. "I'm on your side. Trust me." Attached was a photo, a blurry image of someone handing a manila envelope to a familiar figure. It was the journalist. Jonathan's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. The journalist had been playing both sides all along, feeding Blake just enough to keep him off their trail while secretly working to expose him. The final twist hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. They weren't out of the woods yet, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The game was far from over, but the rules had changed, and now it was Blake who was running out of time.